Well, again, it's good to be with you. I've enjoyed the prior two sessions. I look forward to this one as well. I didn't yesterday explain the background, the virtual background I was using, but Nadia and others who have been in Moscow probably recognize that as the view looking toward the Kremlin, toward Red Square, from the side of the National Hotel. It was a photo I took 10 years ago, almost to the day of yesterday's lecture. But I thought that was a nice alternative to the Monterey background before. And what's there today in background is where I am. That's our place on Cape Cod. Today, however, is cloudy and rainy, so that again is a virtual background. I probably will go a little longer than the 30 minutes that I have been sticking to with the two prior lectures, and then we'll turn to a discussion. I, of course, as before, will respond to your thoughts and your questions, but if the degree to which it's possible to put that in a somewhat larger context, so the way in which is the result of what you've been doing for the last 5 or 6 weeks, your own thinking about Russia as such, and then secondly about Russia's relations with the West and with the U.S., which has been an important emphasis, has modified, has changed in any way, or has it been points of view that you've had actually been reinforced in some fashion by what's happened in the last number of weeks? Today's opening remarks on my part will address the question of the international situation, the international environment, how it's changing at this point. I think all of you know, wherever you come from, whatever programs, particularly if you're in political science programs or contemporary history programs, there's a lot of discussion about how far and how substantially the international system is changing, how Russia and the United States, plus China, obviously figure in that. I start by saying that after the Cold War, many observers believe that the world's largest great powers were converging on a single model of international order. A globalized version of the order the United States had led since the late 1940s. This is now seen as a misapprehension. The sense that the major powers have for at least the last decade been moving in the opposite direction is what drives the uncertainty over what the contemporary international order is and where it's headed. Before I wrestle with that question, and then with where and how the United States and Russia fit into this evolving international system, I want to note a critical conceptual distinction, one that I'll make use of in these remarks. We, again, primarily in the West, have operated with concepts on two different levels. The first is at the structural level, the distribution of power. That's bipolarity or multipolarity, unipolarity, nonpolarity, or Sam Huntington, before he died, even developed the notion of unimultipolarity, that is unipolar in some respects, multipolar in other respects. The second concept, the first at the structural level, the second concept is at the normative level, the liberal international order, by which is meant in particular a set of norms, rules, and institutions. And in the context of liberal international order, that set of norms, rules, and institutions are open markets, that is the free flow of goods and capital and services, open societies, the territorial integrity of states, and the use of force only with UN authorization or for self-defense. And then the institutions that have been created in order to serve these norms. Before and quite apart from COVID-19 and whatever effect it has or will have on the international system, the argument was over what was changing at both the structural and at the normative levels. I thought, and I continue to believe, that that argument was and remains confused, and in the second case, the normative level, more political than it was analytical. At the structural level, the argument was over whether the so-called unipolar moment persisted, unipolar moment dominated by the United States, or whether it was passing, or whether it had already passed. And among US analysts, the divide was between those who argued that US predominance remained, and so too unipolarity, but to preserve it, the United States needed to change its approach to one that was more constructive burden sharing and one less of diktat or domination, versus alternatively, those who believed it was over and the United States needed to redefine its international role, either by focusing on sharing leadership. Leading from behind was often the negative characterization of some of what the Obama administration was doing. It was either by focusing on sharing leadership and co-managing critical challenges and rethinking how the United States should use its foreign policy tools in different ways, or in the second view, alternatively, by embracing the need for retrenchment, to what those who argued for it called offshore balancing. That's an idea that I'll come back to. But it shouldn't be confused with the notion of isolation. Those who argued for offshore balancing were not arguing for renewed US isolation. I said that within the Western side of things. Among Russian and Chinese analysts, unipolarity was over, if it had ever existed, and multipolarity had become the new reality. A multipolarity in which the influence of the United States and the West was seen as weakening. The more vexed, politicized, tension-filled argument has been over the second level, that is the normative level. In the United States and in much of Europe, politicians, pundits, and many in the expert community see the liberal international order as under assault. You're all familiar with that, the literature that stresses the degree which the liberal international order is in defensive position and in danger. And one of the major threats to it is the behavior of authoritarian regimes, in particular Russia and China. I think that's not an unfamiliar notion to most of you. For some time, it's been common in the United States to argue that Russia rejects the rules-based international order led by the United States and is working to undermine it. One of you in the earlier sessions even referred to this idea. I think it was Nadia who made that point. And in the wake of the 2014 Ukrainian crisis, both in Europe and in the United States, the charge was extended in the case of Russia to the claim that Russia had set about destroying the European security order in pursuit of aggressive foreign policy goals. And Ukraine was only a first step of what Russia was capable of doing in the context of Europe and as a threat to European security as we'd known it since the end of the Soviet Union. In Russia, the argument was the opposite. The argument was that faced with a world that no longer was willing to accept US diktat, a world increasingly shaped by the rise and the resurrection of other powers with their own sense of identity and purpose, the United States had gone rogue. Its flailing was the desperation of a state struggling against the loss of power. To quote Vladimir Putin in his 2014 speech justifying the annexation of Crimea, he said, "The United States and its allies prefer not to be guided by international law in their practical policies, but the rule of the gun. They act as they please, believing that they can decide the destinies of the world, that only they can be right, using force however they choose, and manipulating or simply ignoring the United Nations and its Security Council when it stands in the way." I have a different sense of what's happening, a different sense of what's happening at both the structural and the normative level. So let me share that view, and I do it primarily in order to stimulate your views. At the structural level, I don't find the conventional emphasis on the system's polarity, that is bipolarity, multipolarity, non-polarity, as adequate. It's useful, and it certainly deserves a place in our analysis, but I don't think it's adequate. I'm more inclined toward my own rather unconventional, I shouldn't say rather, entirely unconventional notion of a system's axis or axes, what it's poised on, what it's positioned on. For much of the history of modern international relations, from the treaties of Westphalia in the 17th century that normally signal the beginning of the modern era of international relations, that is, from the treaties of Westphalia through the Cold War, the system rested on a single axis. That axis was Europe. And what happened in and around Europe determined the character and the course of international relations as such, as far as it extended. Africa and Asia remained adjuncts of that system, in my view. Although during the Cold War, often these areas, Asia, Africa, and of course the Middle East, figured as the arena of indirect and sometimes very direct great power conflict. I believe that what's happening now is that we're entering what I would call a two or a dual axis system, one that's located or focused in Europe and the other in Asia. In both, the United States will remain a principal actor. Both on the European axis and on the Asian axis, the United States will remain a principal actor. Russia, in my view, in contrast, will remain suspended between both. The two countries are the two major powers that are in both arenas, but I think their position in the two arenas is different. As I say, the United States, in my view, as a principal actor, Russia as suspended between the two. On each axis, the key dynamic, that is what's happening fundamentally, is basically a large question mark. On the Western axis, the question is it the end of the West? That is a cohesive West. The West as an idea. The West as a relatively cohesive collaboration, the transatlantic alliance or relationship, the extension that includes Japan and so on. But is the West as such in the Western axis going to remain cohesive, or is it going to and united around an idea of cohesive collaboration? On the Eastern axis, I think the unanswered large question, a fundamental question, is that of where US-China strategic rivalry is going. Is it going to be a managed relationship that's a mix of interdependence and competition and rivalry, or is it going to tilt entirely in the direction of rivalry and will be deep in a new US-China Cold War? The signs at the moment are not encouraging, but we're not there yet. Note that in both cases, that is both the European and the Asian axis, and the answer to these unanswered fundamental questions depends heavily on US choices. In both cases, the answer will heavily influence the range of choice open to Russia. That's the consequence, from my point of view, of seeing the US as a principal and the other, Russia, as suspended between the two. What will happen will depend heavily on US choices, and US choices will heavily affect the range of choice open to Russia, not exclusively. So I don't mean to say that Russia's foreign policy will simply be an object of US actions on the two axes. Far from it. There will be other things that influence it well. If on the Western axis, the recent trend in US foreign policy during the Trump administration towards self-absorption, abdication of leadership, unilateralism, and confrontation with allies were to remain at some level and then reascend, that will produce one kind of an answer. And Russia will have to respond to the set of choices that outcome allows or imposes. And indeed, the notion of what it allows is important in that context. If the United States has, and the Biden administration is a sign of it, returned to a more traditional, albeit altered leadership role, and this is durable, that is beyond the 2024 election, and I might say coupled with a fractured Europe that preserves its integration project, then the answer will be very different. And so too will Russia's choices be. I'll come back to this issue and be more specific in a moment. On the other axis, that is the Asian one, if the United States mismanages its relationship with China, as it is now doing, abetted by unhelpful Chinese behavior, then the answer will not only create challenges and dangers for Russia, but it will badly warp and stress the entire international system. If, on the other hand, the United States, with more cooperative Chinese behavior, remains in an uneasy and fluid balance between what I earlier referred to interdependence and rivalry with China, then the answer will be yet again quite different. And so too the choices that are available to Russia. At the second normative level, the matter for me is far more fraught, but it's also critical. And I would argue that it's decisive. I believe the post-World War II international system was and remains, albeit in an evolving form, a liberal international order. But it's not the one that figures in most of the literature that you may be familiar with, or the one that its most prominent advocate, John Eikenberry, the professor at Princeton, sees, or that Walter Russell Mead pronounces as dead in the piece that I asked you to read. Indeed, its core values and norms are some of those associated with what might be called the liberal democratic model, the model tracing back to FDR, to Franklin Roosevelt's World War II post-war conception of multilateral international cooperation in pursuit of open markets and open societies, or as Mead argues, maybe tracing back to Woodrow Wilson. But this was its narrowest and is its narrowest version, the one created of, by, and for liberal democracies, or as Eikenberry put it in one thing that he wrote, an environment in which liberal democracies can cooperate for mutual gain, manage their shared vulnerabilities, and protect their way of life. The liberal democratic order, which is what I would call this, the liberal democratic order, was global because it extended to Asia, but it wasn't universal. It didn't include the Soviet Union. And therefore, it was not the international system as such. When you begin talking about the nature of the international system itself, it was a feature of one half of a bipolar international system during the Cold War. The liberal international order, understood as the post-World War II international system, and the way in which I understand it, was and is broader, it is looser, and it's more inclusive. And therefore, it does correspond with the international political system then, during the Cold War, and I would argue now. Its cornerstone was the United Nations system, and remains so, to which all the major powers, including the United States and the Soviet Union, acceded. The UN Charter spelled out its values: multilateral cooperation, great power responsibility embodied in the Security Council and the P5 within the Security Council, human rights, both political and economic, as they were spelled out in formal UN declarations, state sovereignty, the territorial integrity of states and the sanctity of national borders, and the use of force only for self-defense or under UN authorization. Its organizations, from the INF to the International Criminal Court, or the Criminal Court of Justice, from UNESCO to the World Health Organization, and 40 others, in principle, formed an institutional division of labor for addressing in common challenges to international welfare and to international security. At the normative level, these were and are the system's rules, norms, and institutions, the normative level. But, and it's a large but, its rules and norms have long and often been observed only in the breach. And its institutions have always suffered uneven levels of membership, and among members, uneven levels of commitment on the part of those who were within these institutions. What it was not, and indeed what it was designed to prevent, was an international order that was marked by primitive nationalism, by mercantilism, protectionism, and beggar thy neighbor economic relations, the unconstrained use of force, and the disregard of law, either international law or the laws of war. That is a world without rules, without norms, or institutional constraints. over the years, the liberal democratic portion of the international system, the way in which I'm defining things, acquired separate institutions and alliances such as NATO or GATT, the forerunner to the World Trade Organization, and the G7 arrangement. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, and as the bipolar Cold War order faded in the 1990s, it appeared that the broader international liberal order was merging into a universal liberal democratic order. That is, the international liberal order as I define it, based on the UN, its principles and institutions, was merging into a universal liberal democratic order. That impression was reinforced, I'm speaking now primarily the 1990s, by four factors. The first of them was Sam Huntington's notion of a third wave of democratization. That is the global trend reflected in 60 countries throughout Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa that underwent some form of democratic transition following Portugal's 1974 Carnation Revolution. Secondly, Russia's break with its communist past and seeming embrace of markets and democracy, and its shift to alignment with the West, or seemingly so in the 1990s under Yeltsin. Third, by interdependence as globalization and the end of great power strategic rivalry, the way in which Tom Friedman wrote about an earth that was flat, and it seemed that the nature of international politics as we'd known it in the early 20th century, much of the 20th century and those before, was over. And finally, the readiness of Russia and China to accept rules and institutions associated with the liberal democratic order, such as China's admission to the World Trade Organization, Russia's participation in NATO's Partnership for Peace program when it wasn't admitted to or didn't want to be admitted to NATO, despite its opposition to NATO enlargement and its commitment to a Euro-Atlantic, but with a commitment to a Euro-Atlantic security community. The Russians participated in that effort, Euro-Atlantic security community that stretched in the language of the days from Vancouver to Vladivostok. It turns out to have been a chimera, an illusion. And instead, we have different versions of what went wrong and where we are. Eikenberry maintains that the liberal world order is collapsing because the leading patrons, starting with the United States, have given up on it. Again, you can place yourself among these interpretations if you do believe that that the notion of a liberal international order was a chimera, or if you believe that my notion of the liberal international order based around UN principles and institutions is threatened. The others, like John Mersheimer and Walter Russell Mead, maintain that the norms of a liberal international order, whether it's the one described by Eikenberry's version or the one I've just laid out, was never real. It was simply geopolitics 101 all along. The international system is one of great power rivalry and shifting balances of power. The weak and previously sidelined have been re-empowered, and they're determined to alter the system's rules and institutions in ways that better reflect their national interests. Russian analysts, in terms of interpreting what's happened, argue that the liberal international order is collapsing because it is the project of a self-absorbed West led by an arrogant United States with a sense of entitlement, indifferent to the interests and preferences and values of other countries. And as power shifts to these other countries, the United States and its allies can no longer have their way or call the shots. I think that all three explanations are wrong to the extent that they imply either of two things, not necessarily entirely wrong, but wrong to the extent that they imply either of two things. First, that in this volatile environment, that Russia and or China are revolutionary rather than reformist powers. And I use that notion of a revolutionary power the way in which Henry Kissinger used it, particularly when he did that remarkable book on the Congress of Vienna. That is, a revolutionary power is one determined to destroy the existing system. Napoleon, Hitler, rather than to change the system's rules and gain greater voice within it. I believe that neither Russia nor China appear to have a notion of what a fundamentally different system would be. And China has benefited from the existing system. And surely they don't want a world without rules, norms, and institutional constraints. So I rather doubt that they're rejecting the liberal international order as I define it, even though they certainly mean to reorient it or adjust it in ways that better serve their national interests. But the difference between a revolutionary and a reformist power is fundamental in terms of international stability. And I think people have too easily accepted the notion that at some level, both Russia and China are what Kissinger would define as revolutionary powers. Or secondly, I think they're wrong if they assume that although tattered and under assault, the liberal international order, as I define it, is moribund and is fated to disappear. The damage to it comes from serious threats. It comes from the inability, even the dysfunction of governments that have failed to deal well with their society's underlying problems and frustrations, leading to the destructive impact of populism and xenophobic nationalism. Secondly, the surge of global challenges, such as mass immigration generated by violent conflicts, the growing socioeconomic inequality within and between countries, the downsides of globalization and pandemics that neither governments or global governance has begun to manage. Has there ever been a greater failure of global governance than the response to COVID-19? And then third, the willingness of major powers to flout the rules, such as they have been. The United States in Iraq in 2003, Russia in Crimea in 2014, China's military projects in the South China Sea. But I would argue that in reality, the liberal international order stands, battered, yes, but if there is an alternative emerging, it's not order of any kind, but simply the full degradation of this order. In this uncertain context, over the next 10 years, Russia and the United States face fundamental choices. That's my view. How they will choose, I can't predict. But I can insist that the consequences of the choices they make are predictable. It leads to the point of my remarks on how they will fit into all of this, how they will figure in the fate of an international system that's under stress. In the US case, I think there are three fundamental directions, although I preface all this by saying that in reality, the way all this will work out is not likely to fall within any one of the three alternatives neatly, but as a heuristic device for underscoring what seems to me the range of the choice, the following. First of all, a return to what we had in the Trump administration, what Haas at the Council, the Director of the Council on Foreign Relations has called its withdrawal doctrine. I think that's a mislabel. I would have described the Trump policy or approach to international politics and US foreign policy as go it alone, a go it alone doctrine, and a withdrawal strategy, withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, withdrawal from the nuclear arms control agreements, and so on. Let's call that abdication of US leadership. And it's not, even though for the moment it may be partially eclipsed, that's not to say that it isn't still potentially there and capable of recrudescence at some point. The second is what I would call the reassertion of US leadership along traditional lines, although with a shift in emphasis. And I think that's what we're seeing with the Biden administration. A greater emphasis on addressing challenges at home as the essential foundation for US foreign policy, an emphasis on restoring US moral authority, say by returning to a government-wide focus on uplifting the rights of women and girls at home and around the world, including by focusing on measures to address gender-based violence internationally, reaffirming the ban on torture and restoring greater transparency in our military operations, including efforts to reduce civilian casualties, leading generally in defending human rights, which we see now as a substantial issue in the US-China relationship and as a continuing issue in US-Russian relations. The renewal and repurposing of alliances, but the reaffirmation of alliances, even while adjusting the way in which they work and to what purposes. Assuming a lead in promoting international cooperation to deal with major 21st century global challenges, climate change, pandemics, and so on. And organizing and hosting a global summit for democracy to renew the spirit and shared purpose of the nations of the free world. Those are initiatives that are yet to come, but they've been foreshadowed. The third alternative is what might be called altered US leadership in a form of retrenchment. It's an argument that academics like Stephen Walt and Barry Posen have been making, but it has a political echo among politicians who are saying something of the same. Reduce extended alliances, reduce distant force deployments, and shrink security involvement on a global scale. Assume that other countries now have the strength and the wealth and the reason to provide for their own security and defense. Reduce priority security concerns to three overarching, in importance, overseas regions: Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf. That is, to regions of fundamental importance to US interests because of resources, wealth, and geopolitical geography that they command. And in those regions, depend on local actors to counter threats and support their resources for doing so. Intervene with US military forces only when an important regional equilibrium collapses or is in danger of collapsing. That is, when a hostile actor is set to conquer an area. Then afterwards, when you have intervened in this fashion for this reason, withdraw once more. That's the offshore balancing that I referred to earlier. Russia's fundamental choices, and I'm now drawing closer to the close of what I have to say, I think are basically four. One would be alignment with China. If the future of the US-China relationship is to be Cold War. A second would be an equilibrium strategy, one that's advocated by Dmitry Trenin, the outstanding analyst, Russian analyst that you heard from early in the course. An equilibrium strategy by which he means partnership with China, but not alliance. If alliance implies a named adversary, the United States, balance with India, Japan, and Europe, and avoid confrontation with the United States. He would call that an equilibrium strategy. A third is a multi-vector policy that would require a repaired relationship with the West, including with the United States. And it's not clear that that's easily within the cards, but theoretically it is a potential option for Russian foreign policy. And it would figure if in the context of the US-China relationship and movement toward Cold War, rather than aligning with China, the choice is to begin balancing in that Cold War. And the fourth is it was sounded a year ago. I don't know that it's had a lot of echo. It was argued by Sergei Karaganov and with Dmitry Suslov. They wrote about it. International leadership with a mission, and that mission would be a new value system for the international system, a new kind of responsibility in terms of protecting the values that I've associated with the UN system and so on. The choices that will be made by the United States and Russia among these three, and whatever combination, whatever cross-cutting choices are made, will not, as I said at the beginning, fully conform to any of these categories, but they'll tend toward one, perhaps blur the distinction between the two. For me, all of this ends with two fundamental propositions. The first is the last thing that Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote. He argued that peace and security in the 21st century will depend on whether the three dominant military powers, China, Russia, and the United States, work together in support of global stability or not. Absent that, a fundamental threat to global stability. The second proposition is that the United States and Russia have throughout the post-Cold War era, and in particular conspicuous ways, particularly conspicuous ways, they today overlook the stakes they have in the relationship and the stake everyone else has in the way in which they address them. And these are major issues that I may have touched on in passing in prior lectures. Leading and in managing, I certainly did in this case, an increasingly complex and dangerous multipolar nuclear world. Working for a Europe that's whole and at peace, if not by building a Euro-Atlantic security community, then by reversing the remilitarization of European security and easing that confrontation along a new Central European front, ensuring that the European, Eurasian, and Asian security systems and the dynamics within them are compatible and not at odds. These systems overlap, adjusting to the rise of China cooperatively rather than competitively, and so on. These are the stakes. And both Moscow and Washington have for years either never faced up to them or have long overlooked them. I finish by saying I'm not naive. At least I don't think I'm naive. I'm not arguing that leadership in the United States and Russia will suddenly reverse course and embrace either of these propositions, either Brzezinski's proposition about the need for the three most powerful military powers to cooperate rather than compete, or that they will begin recognizing what really is at stake in their relationship and in the unfortunate context of the new Cold War, or even if they began to do so, that the politics in either country will let them do it. Rather, I offer the two propositions as, yes, in my view, requirements if the future is to be stable rather than unstable. The world is to be safer rather than less so, but more so from an analytical point of view as a standard for judging which among the three potential choices for the US foreign policy and which among the four potential choices for Russian foreign policy could move an evolving international system in their direction, and which would move in the opposite direction. That's really the larger question that I leave with you now. And at this point, we turn to our conversation. I'm sorry for having gone a little bit longer than the 30 minutes.